American Conspiracy, The Murder of Integrity, Credibility and Truth, Part 7. The definition of the word conspiracy, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it's a group involved in secret or criminal activities. It's a secret agreement or cooperation between two parties for an illegal or dishonest purpose. It's a secret plan for accomplishing evil or unlawful ends. That is the correct definition of a conspiracy. However, the media now uses conspiracy and people who believe in conspiracies as people that are disillusional. That isn't the definition. The conspiracy is the investigation of a secret group involved in illegal and unlawful activities called the octopus, which is a cartel of former and current intelligence agents, senior government officials, heads of corporations and banks, and in partnership with organised crime. This podcast is going to present to you the evidence that Gordon Savell, a Canadian journalist and film producer, a co-author with myself of a book to be released shortly called Lethal Justice, details our 24 years of detailed investigations into the death of Danny Casolaro and the evidence of the Promus software affair. In 2004, we filed a Freedom of Information Access request to the Martinsburg Police to get access to their official investigation records into the death of Danny Casolaro, and we were blocked. They stated to us that the files had been sealed at the request of the Department of Justice. 20 years later, in March 2024 this year, the records were released to the producers of The American Conspiracy, the Netflix series. We could not believe our eyes that they're willing to release those records for a conspiracy story where the producers, Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats, were asked to meet with my American attorney. Given that they had lied to Trey Casolaro and myself and deceived us, withheld all of the credible evidence that we provided willingly to them to be shown to the public to let them make a determination of truth. And they were asked very simple questions by my American attorney, the respected Daniel Sheehan. We asked them what they thought was the probability that Danny Casolaro had been murdered or committed suicide. And we also wanted to know why they withheld the evidence that I had given them, and also some other questions relating to the cover-up of the evidence that's within the Martinsburg police records. We now hold and copied all the records of the Martinsburg police that were prevented for us to see back in 2004. And today I'm going to reveal you to you that the official Martinsburg police report, the official FBI reports, the official US Department of Justice investigation into the death of Danny Casolaro deliberately withheld damaging evidence that proves beyond doubt that Danny Casolaro was not depressed, that Danny Casolaro had gone to Martinsburg not for the purposes of taking a shoelace with him and a razor blade to commit suicide, as indicated by the two reports of the Department of Justice and the Martinsburg police, but he had gone to Martinsburg to pick up boxes of official IRS records that were put into his car. I know the name of the IRS agent at the IRS Computer Centre who put the boxes of documents into his car. Witnesses had seen Danny Casolaro's car parked near the IRS Computer Centre in Martinsburg on the day, Friday the 9th of August 1991. In addition, we knew the evidence that he was collecting. We also knew that he had met with William Turner, and we have recorded interviews with William Turner and affidavits that he provided to Elliot Richardson, who was the former Attorney General under President Nixon, who was the attorney representing William Hamilton and Inslaw Inc. We know that Danny Casolaro was meeting with someone from Senator Byrd's office, Robert Byrd's office, someone from IRS, Computer Centre in Martinsburg, and Robert Altman, who was the attorney that had the power of attorney to represent the Kuwait royal family's investment, hidden investment in BCCI, who had met reluctantly with Danny Casolaro because he was threatening to give his legal evidence of the BCCI checks and the Monte Carlo BCCI accounts for the tow missiles involving Adnan Khashoggi, manager Gorbanafar, Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, Richard Secord, Oliver North, and William Wilson, the ambassador to the Vatican, and Robert Sensi. And Danny Casolaro had all those records with him when he was in Martinsburg. And we proved in the last podcast that Danny Casolaro, they found one of the pages indicating the tow missile deal. I will do a follow-up podcast which will show you the pages that preceded it and the pages that followed it that was with that one page. And it's quite clear to me that whoever cleaned the room out and took all of his evidence, including his briefcase, obviously missed that one page. It must have been hidden, we suspect, probably under a blanket or a sheet or something like that on the bed that was missed by those cleaning out the room after killing him. The evidence is overwhelming that the complete folder with the documents pre and following that document and afterwards was from the Bob Bickel correspondence file, which included the BCCI checks and letters addressed to President George Bush Sr., Lawrence Walsh, and several other attorneys, and records relating to illegal arms and weapons and technology that was being sold to not just Iran but also to Iraq. But the key part now is, today we have access to all the records that Christian Hansen and Zachary Trees, the producers of the Netflix series The American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders, had access to when filming the series. And we're going to show you the documents that were in the records that they know exists. The Martinsburg police know exists. The FBI knows that it existed, and the US Department of Justice, and was conveniently withheld from the public and the official records, where they state that there was no evidence that Danny Casolaro was being threatened or that he had any evidence that was damaging that would be a motive to kill him. He was depressed and went to Martinsburg with a shoelace and razor blade for the purposes of committing suicide. So let's begin the journey now of showing you what was in the Martinsburg police records that we were prevented from obtaining in 2004, 20 years ago, and we knew they were in there because we've interviewed the key witnesses that Danny Casolaro telephoned on the Friday morning before he's found dead. We're going to play for you in this podcast our interview with Bobby Riconosciuto, who was speaking to Danny for 2 to 4 hours every day, right up to the Friday, the 9th of August in the morning, when Danny Casolaro telephoned her and told her that he has picked up documents, boxes of documents from the IRS computer centre, and with his contacts. He was meeting with his contacts at the IRS computer centre and US Treasury. And then he was meeting with William Turner in the afternoon, who actually provided 2 sealed envelopes of documents that he was keeping in safekeeping in his safe for Danny Casolaro. And Danny Casolaro was excited. Now, I have 2 other witnesses who I've interviewed. Unfortunately, Bobby Riconosciuto has passed away now, but our recorded interviews were the records that I was offering to the Martinsburg police in 2018 through to 2024 to help them to reopen the investigation, given that Danny Casolaro had called several people, and the people still alive are willing to testify in a US court to confirm their testimony that's recorded to me. So we're going to show you that Danny Casolaro had picked up boxes of documents from IRS that were damaging evidence to not only Robert Booth Nichols and other organised crime members, but also to high-level officials within the government. In previous podcasts, we have shown you that Trey Casolaro and myself were deceived by Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats, and they produced a fantasy, fictitious Netflix series that's not a documentary based on legal evidence, and it was co-produced with the assistance of Anne Klink, who worked for Dr. Earl Bryan. And the damaging evidence that Danny had was the records that were proving that he was involved. Her boss, Earl Bryan, was involved in criminal activities, and he was convicted as a criminal on fraud and sent to prison. But the evidence that I provided to Tony Casolaro, the brother of Danny, Tony passed it on to Anne Klink. And Tony then refused to work with me, collaborate with me to help the Martinsburg police reopen their investigation, given that I was recommended to speak to Tony Casolaro by former FBI agent Thomas Gates. In March 2024 this year, Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats agreed to meet with my American attorney, Daniel Sheen. Not only do they state categorically that there is no evidence they've seen to convince them that Danny Casolaro had been murdered, but we asked a very simple question. If you look at the photograph shows multiple deep slashes on both wrists of Danny Casolaro using a razor blade. And we asked Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats a very simple question, given that they're now the experts on everything. How could they explain that Danny Casolaro has slashed one of his wrists severely, deep cuts, down to the tendons, cutting the nerves, given that we know that the agony that he would be experiencing would be debilitating once you cut through nerves? How did he reach across with one slashed wrist to grip a razor blade to slash the other? And Zachary Treats, as the expert, says Danny Casolaro put the razor blade between his teeth and used his teeth to slash his second wrist. If you believe that, then explain why there's blood everywhere over the floor. There's a sign of struggle. There's even blood on the wall up to a metre high above the bath, where he's attempting to get out of the bath. It doesn't seem like someone that wants to commit suicide, but is this the level of their expertise? No limit, forensic science. They have no training in medical science. They have no training in anything, not even in as investigators. But this is their explanation. Well, contrary to Danny Casolaro being depressed, no one's explaining why he's calling several people and he's excited. He's got all the evidence. He's picked up boxes of documents from IRS Computer Centre, 2 sealed envelopes, and his briefcase with all the evidence on the BCCI checks. Everything's missing from his car, from his room, but they missed one document. That does explain that Danny Casolaro had evidence of the BCCI checks. Let me show you now our original application made in 2004, and we're advised that they're sealed. When we got the Martinsburg police records eventually, they don't have a copy of our access for information, but they have a copy of Christian Hansen's request in 2014. So given that Christian Hansen and Zachary went in and photographed all the evidence in the box, did you see any of the documents that I'm about to show you on the Netflix series? And why not? Why the deceptive narrative? In my previous podcast, I even show you the level of their deception, that they don't want to bring to the attention of the public that Danny Casolaro, in yellow there, was going to Thailand and Burma and Laos to meet with tribal leaders. And I have all our interviews directly with Lance Trimmer, Beau Gritz, and copies of all the photographs of the opium and their interviews. They were talking to Danny Casolaro about all the opium coming in and going through Nugan Bank. Also planning to go to Kuwait City. I wonder why he's going to Kuwait City. Going to Brussels and Zurich, London. Have a look at the green bits that they didn't read out. He wanted to go to Chile to meet Carlos Ghosn, and also to Sydney, Australia, to meet Bernie Houghton and the Royal Commission investigators and others, and he was going to go to Australia for 7 days. Isn't that interesting that they left that out? He also wanted to meet with Michael Hand so that he could ask him about the evidence of all the drugs and the money laundering of gold bullion through Nugan Bank and weapons. And then he was going to go to prison to interview Ed Wilson. These are the green bits that they left out. We also know that Danny Casolaro met with arms dealer Sarkis Solganolanian. He's the fat Arab man that was arrogant, that was seen by a waitress. And the reason why he wanted to interview him is that Richard Babian's affidavit provided to Bill Hamilton, together with Ari Ben-Menashe, confirms that he was present in Iraq with Richard Secord and Earl Bryan when they're selling weapons, and also the Promus software. And he was then going across to meet with, again, Ari Ben-Menashe, who's in Australia at the particular time of the week he dies, giving evidence to our Royal Commission on a $6 million cheque being transferred across by Dr. Earl Bryan to Alan Bond and the Prime Minister of Australia, thanking them for all the Iran-Contra arms being shipped through Australia throughout all of the 1980s. And also he wanted to meet with pilot Heinrich Rapp and businessman Kilpatrick, and also go to Santa Monica, Long Beach, to meet closed source arms specialist Peter Zukoski, and also homicide investigators and Richard Branecki. Now, in my next podcast, I will show you that Danny Casolaro had the letters to President Bush Sr. and Lawrence Walsh and Boyd and Gray, and from the attorneys for Richard Branecki, with all the evidence of all of the Octopus members who are being protected from criminal prosecutions, involved in the tow missiles, the weapons, chemical weapons, and the Promus software that's been sold to Iraq, and missiles to Iran and Iran-Contra. In 2004, from prison, Michael Riconosciuto wrote letters to me confirming all the activities of Robert Booth Nichols, Wackenhut in Australia, and also the laundering of drugs and gold bullion through Nugan Bank with Peter Briggs. And I met with Douglas Mayer, the Queen's Counsellor, working with Frank Costigan, and he confirmed the evidence that Michael had given to me was true. And more importantly, I have copies of all of the records of all our Royal Commissions that shows that everything that Robert Booth Nichols and Wackenhut were involved, and Fidco were involved, and Earl Bryan were involved in Australia, arms, drugs, and links with the mafia, is true. And Danny Casolaro had in his records similar evidence, because Michael told me he gave it to Danny Casolaro, and that's what he was investigating, and it's all true. And so I have followed the money, the evidence, and that explains why he wanted to meet with Peter Zukoski. And he's talking with Robert Booth Nichols, and he wants to talk to Michael Hand and Ed Wilson, because our Royal Commissions, 3 of them, show all the drugs and arms and gold bullion were going through Nugan Bank in Australia. And soon after, the mysterious Robert Booth Nichols visits Australia to make threats against my life. And I've covered all this, but he says all your problems in Australia lead directly to Alexander Haig. In my next podcast, I'll show you that Danny Casolaro was investigating secret trust accounts and gold bullion that is identified by Elliot Richardson and William Hamilton in their legal case against the Department of Justice. I have the evidence of all of that in the Royal Commissions, particularly the Costigan Royal Commission, that goes directly to the octopus for buying and forcing Inslaw into bankruptcy. And the same groups are involved in shipping heroin from Lebanon and gold bullion worth trillions of dollars. Danny Casolaro has that in his notes. Michael Riconosciuta had told him about it. It's all true. I've got the evidence. That's the discussions that I'm having with the Costigan Royal Commissioner in 2004. And that's why Danny Casolaro is meeting with IRS Computer Centre to bring back the evidence that I provided to the Martinsburg police. I told them that we had a recorded interview with Sam Cross and that he was going to meet Danny Casolaro on the Saturday night. Now, he says that. We're not sure if it's the Saturday night he's found dead or the following Saturday night, but Danny Casolaro wasn't going to commit suicide. He was going to meet with Sam Cross. And he was also going to call Bobby Riconosciuta Monday morning and two other witnesses Monday morning as soon as he gets back. And Sam Cross says categorically that the whole thing with his death just didn't sit well with a lot of people. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. I also do believe that Danny Casolaro was murdered. And Sam Cross is the former chief of Indigo Police. And he says, I've never heard anyone else say anything else about Danny Casolaro's briefcase. But the way I was supposed to recognise him was that we were going to meet at a restaurant in Northern Virginia. And he said, I will have a small brown briefcase sitting by my chair. Over the years, governments, most of them are on a feeding frenzy where they get to the point where certain segments of the government feel that the means justifies the end and they can do whatever they want. And I'm sure that happens a lot. We are supposed to be a law-abiding country, God-fearing, and founded on the principles of the Bible and so forth. But I learned a long time ago the governments, no matter where they are, all over the world, they are all the same. I think it will continue and it will only get worse. They're clear words from Sam Cross, patriotic, enforcing the law, and even the FBI had released an assassin, mass murderer, Philip Arthur Thompson, from prison to assassinate him, and a local attorney prosecuting Dr. John P. Phillips for attempted murder. That's how corrupt the powers in the US government have become. And this was the proof, as we get on to the evidence in the box, that Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats had full access to, had copied, and didn't show the public. We told them that Danny Casolaro was scheduled to meet with someone from Senator Byrd's office, and the banks Clark Clifford and Robert Altman were also in Martinsburg. We also told them that Dion Davies was an expert banker lobbyist at Senator Byrd's office and the best person to validate his damaging evidence of the BCCI and World Bank documents that were a direct threat to the attorneys of Clark Clifford and Robert Altman. Dion Davies was previously dating Major Joe Sequela, and she represented the American Banker Association and would have had interest in commercial and political interests of Clark Clifford, Robert Altman representing BCCI and First American Bank shares. And in the official Martinsburg Police report, Mr. William Turner recently told the Hamiltons, who relayed the information to us, that Mr. Casolaro planned to meet in Martinsburg with Peter Wiednix, Joe Sequela, an unidentified person from Senator Byrd's office, an unidentified IRS employee. Do you see that? Unidentified IRS employee and attorney Robert Altman. A caller to the Unsolved Mysteries hotline reported seeing Clark Clifford, Robert Altman, driving in Martinsburg on the day of Mr. Casellaro's death in a late model Chevrolet Caprice. We have no reason to believe either of these claims. Do you like that? We have no reason to believe either of these claims to be true. Well, let's see if the Martinsburg police is telling the truth. He was going to meet with someone from Senator Byrd's office, Joe Sequella, Robert Altman, and an unidentified IRS employee. Well, in my last podcast, the official Martinsburg police records, I went through all the numbers and they had the evidence. Danny Casellaro had called 202-224-3954 on the 7th of August. Turns out it's Senator Byrd's office. Why would he be calling and speaking for 5 minutes to Senator Byrd's office before going to Martinsburg? That seems to be true, doesn't it? And that's their evidence. Not mine, theirs. They also found the document, letters to George Bush and Lawrence Walsh and Gordon Gray, tow missile deals, BCCI checks and Monte Carlo account transactions. They have in the record one page. In the next podcast, I'll show you the pages before and after in the complete file that Danny Casellaro had and Klink took from his house. The FBI agents went to Ann Klink's house to look at his evidence relating to BCCI, and you will see that he had all of those documents with him, a copy of them, and for some reason, whoever cleaned his room out to take his briefcase, his documents that were stuffed full and seen by a waitress the day before in his room, are all missing, but they missed one. Why only this one when the ones before and after are more damaging to the President of the United States and Robert Altman? And so now let's look at the cover-up of evidence during the investigation where the briefcase is missing, 2 sealed envelopes are missing, and boxes of IRS documents were all missing, bar one document. On the 23rd of March 24, after watching the sickening betrayal by Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats with their American Conspiracy Octopus Murders TV series put onto Netflix, I wrote immediately back to the Martinsburg police, to George Swartwood and his attorneys, following their previous correspondence with me, rejecting my offer to help. And I tell them I have my recorded interviews with 5 independent witnesses that testify they received telephone calls from Danny Casellaro from Martinsburg on Friday the 9th of August 1991 and confirmed that Danny Casellaro was not depressed. Rather, he was extremely positive and excited, confirming that he had collected several boxes of documentary evidence that he had collected from the IRS Computer Center in Martinsburg. Danny Casellaro stated that he has now finished his book and he will immediately call them on Monday morning when he arrives home. I also state clearly to them, the reason I'm writing to them is I'm sickened. We're sickened of the fact that we're watching the Martinsburg police handed across all the evidence to Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats to do their conspiracy fantasy film. These witnesses watched the Netflix series with anger and disgust, and they have now advised me they are prepared to confirm their testimonies that refute the findings of your investigations in any US court. I ask categorically, did you find many boxes of documents in his car? These are the IRS boxes of documents that were put in by the head of security of IRS into Danny Casoloro's car, seen by other witnesses parked near the IRS building on the day. Did you find the briefcase with the BCCI checks? Did you find 2 sealed folders of documents provided him by William Turner in the car park on the Friday afternoon? I received no response other than, will allow you now to have a copy to review the evidence of the Martinsburg police. They don't respond to any of my questions. They don't respond to my offer in 2018. They're just admitting, yeah, we gave them to the kids on the Netflix series, but we'll let you have access now. But you've got to make another application. Freedom of Information Access Request. Here is a copy of my official email sent to them. I'm asking them to confirm the respective dates when the US Department of Justice advised you to seal and now unseal the records, because they had to be unsealed in order for them to give them to the Netflix series. I reconfirm I've got my recorded interviews with Jack Blum, that he never received copies of the BCCI checks that we know that Danny Casolaro had. And then I'm going through here, I'm just reconfirming, there's all my questions. And then I ask him one more question at the end. Did you find the evidence at his house that he had previously removed a shoelace from one of his shoes, purchased the brand of razor blades at a local store that he used to cut both wrists to prove he was depressed and he planned to travel down to Martins with the intention of being alone to commit suicide? Because they did not investigate any of this evidence that I'm showing you and do not provide the following evidence that I'll show you in any of the reports. Neither the FBI, Department of Justice, or Martinsburg Police revealed what they knew. I also invited them to read the article on Covert Action magazine and watch podcasts 1, 2, and 3 on my website of the evidence that I had published back in 2022. And I'd also invite them to correspond with my American attorney, Daniel Sheen. And now I will play for you the recorded interview that Gordon Savall, Canadian investigative journalist, recorded with Bobby Riconosciuto back in 2004 when we made our access for Freedom of Information request. And I'll read it again. She received a telephone call from Danny Casolaro on the morning of Friday the 9th of August 1991. I reconfirm to the viewers now that I have recorded interviews with 2 other independent witnesses who Danny Casolaro also rang on the morning of Friday the 9th of August 91 to confirm that he's excited. He's picked up all the boxes of records from the IRS computer center. He's got everything. And this is what she says. Danny Casolaro had met with William Turner, and he also met with his contacts in Martinsburg at the IRS Computer Center and US Treasury. She says, I spoke to Danny Casolaro on Friday morning, and he said that he was meeting later with William Turner because he was there to pick up stuff. That doesn't sound like he's going to Martinsburg to commit suicide. He's going to Martinsburg to pick up stuff. Danny Casolaro said, We are ready. We have got him. That's after he gets all the documents from IRS, Computer Centre in Martinsburg. So let's play that for you. And you can hear the recorded interview by Gordon Savell.
Well, you can kiss him goodbye. Well, he's not here anymore. It's like Bob having somebody tell him that Danny was dead before he was dead. Michael was freaking out all weekend.
Who's Bob?
Nichols. And Michael was freaking out. You need to find him. You need to find him. You need to find him. And I said, Michael, he said he was going to be gone for the whole weekend. He's going to Martinsburg. He'll be back on Sunday night. I'll talk to him Monday morning. I talked to him Friday. It's okay. But mostly because I didn't want Michael upset anyway, and Bob did as much of that was not so, where he would have somebody that was in the prison tell Michael, hey, Bobby and the kids are gone, and then Michael would panic and find me, Before his arrest, when things like this would happen, he would call it dancing around on one foot. They keep me dancing on one foot so that I can't concentrate on the things that are necessary, that we need to do.
So you talked to Danny Friday night?
Friday morning, I think.
And who was he meeting?
Oh, gosh. Seems like he was going to meet Chuck and then that other guy. I don't remember.
Chuck who?
Hayes. I don't remember what the other guy's name is.
Peter Wiedniks or O'Brien? Peter Wiedniks?
No, he wasn't meeting with Peter.
Oh, he wasn't?
I don't know. I mean, he was going specifically to meet with, that guy that worked for the computer company that, I don't know.
Turner?
That's it, yeah. Yeah.
Did he tell you who he was meeting?
Yeah, and he said, and we are ready. We had Danny and I spent 4 hours a day minimum on the phone.
You didn't record him?
Danny did, some of them.
But you didn't record him, did you?
No.
Shit.
No, how would I?
That's too bad.
I was on the road with 4 kids.
That's okay, that's fine. But he recorded you.
As far as I know, and he was a really good note taker. When he would tell me about, he tried to get me and the kids to come there. We'll figure out a way, you guys can live here, or live in the neighborhood. I'll help you get stable, get the kids, out of homeschool, back in regular school, where you don't have to worry about these things.
Let's go back to your conversation Friday night with Danny.
I don't know that it was Friday night. I think it was Friday morning.
Friday morning.
I don't know.
Let's just
late Thursday night.
Okay. So
but I know that I was supposed to, he was going to call me when he got back.
Are you positive he said he was meeting Chuck Hayes?
No.
You're not
I'm
positive?
not anymore. But it's probably in my day runner.
Right. So you can't say positively who said who he was meeting anymore?
No, except that I'm sure Turner, that was part of it, because he was going to pick up stuff. Because I'm thinking it was Turner. It wasn't. I don't think it was Chuck Hayes. That I can't remember anymore. I'd have to think about this for a while.
Okay.
It's been a long time since
That's okay.
thought
I
about
understand.
those kinds of details of it.
Okay.
But I know that we had. He said we got him. We've got him.
What did he mean? We've got him.
I know he had met with some relative of his that was at the IRS. That worked at the main computer center for the IRS.
It was a relative?
Yeah, some sort of, cousin, something, I don't know.
Male or female?
I don't remember. But I remember Michael had said, don't have them go through directly, because Danny was all excited, well, he can just punch it up on the computer and find this. I don't even remember what they were looking for. And Michael said, don't do that. Because it will throw up an internal flag. You don't understand the way that.
So Danny had a contact at IRS.
And this Treasury.
Pardon me?
And Treasury, I think.
And Treasury.
Yeah.
And he felt that this contact could just punch up stuff on the computer and get him the information.
And perhaps they could have, but the way Michael said for them to go about getting the information was much more circuitous.
Circuitous.
Afraid a circuitous route to get the information.
What was really interesting about the Martinsburg police report and the Zipperstein report for the Department of Justice into the investigation of the death of Danny Casolaro, they both questioned the credibility of William Turner, doubted his testimony that he had met Danny Casolaro at the car park on the Friday afternoon. And yet, William Turner immediately wanted to speak to Elliot Richardson. He was worried about his safety as soon as Danny Casolaro was found dead, and he gives an affidavit confirming that Danny Casolaro was in Martinsburg to pick up documents, 2 sealed envelopes from him on the Pentagon fraud involving Hughes Aircraft. In addition, that he had the BCCI checks, that he had the evidence, and that he was meeting with Robert Altman, who had reluctantly agreed to meet with him as he was threatening to give that evidence to Senator Kerry's investigation committee. And I've also proven in the official telephone records of Danny Casolaro that he had called Jack Blum, the investigator working for Senator Kerry, at his house telephone number twice. That is independent evidence that what William Turner was saying was true, and more importantly, the evidence that Danny Casolaro has, which was never provided by the Martinsburg police, the FBI, and Klink, whose boss was Earl Bryan. The whole folder of evidence that she took from his house was never provided to Senator Kerry and Jack Blum for the investigations, yet they were demanding that Robert Altman hands those records across. All the transactions of the tow missiles and the bank accounts at Monte Carlo with Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gorbanafar. Danny Casolaro had the smoking gun. So let's go back. In my previous podcast, I play a segment of Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats being asked about do they know about this Australian called Peter Osborne, and the article in Covert Action magazine confirming that William Turner's testimony confirms that Danny Casolaro was going to Martinsburg to meet with Peter Vienix, Joseph Queller, and also someone from Senator Byrd's office and an identified RS employee and attorney Robert Altman, who had reluctantly agreed to meet with him. After he impersonates a monkey and questions where I got this from, as you can see, in 2016 I had sent that evidence to Christian Hansen when he's pretending to work with me and Gordon Savell and Trey Casolaro and trying to find out what evidence we got, promising that he wants to reveal it to the public so that they can learn the truth about the death of Danny Casolaro. Now let's go to the official Martinsburg police report. The box of evidence that Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats had in advance for doing the Netflix series, did they show you this? This is the Martinsburg police interview with David Looney, who was having a drink with Danny at the bar on the Friday evening, and he says the following: Danny was waiting for some Arabs that he was going to meet with them, and then says, and there is an IRS agent sitting next to them at the bar when he retired to his bedroom. Isn't that interesting that the last person to see Danny Casolaro alive is telling the Martinsburg police that there is an IRS agent sitting next to them at the bar? That statement never appeared in the official Martinsburg police report or the Zipperstein report, despite the testimony of William Turner. And now I'm telling you, I've got recorded interviews with several witnesses who Danny Casolaro rang on the Friday morning to confirm that he picked up all the boxes of records and evidence from the IRS computer centre. And have a look at this. This is in the official Martinsburg police files. I'm surprised Christian Hansen and Zachary didn't put this up. It's an official letter from the US Department of Justice from Nicholas Boer, who's been appointed to investigate the theft of the Promus software. And it says, this is a follow-up to your telephone conversation with FBI agent Charles Peters, who is working with me on an investigation of allegations of wrongdoing by the Department of Justice employees. Please consider this letter as our official request for production of the autopsy and all police reports, including photographs and other supporting documents relating to the death of Daniel Casolaro. If you have any questions about this request, please contact me or the Assistant United States Attorney Michael J. Shepard. Thank you for your assistance. Yours truly, Nicholas Boer. That's really interesting that the Department of Justice investigating the theft of the Inslaw's Promus software that Danny Casolaro is investigating is writing to the Martinsburg Police on official US Department of Justice letterhead. It's dated April 21st, 1992. I wonder why Christian Hansen and Zachary didn't show that. That has huge implications, that everyone's wanting to know what Danny Casolaro had and what the Martinsburg Police found. And have a look at this. This is another letter from the Department of Justice. And again, per our telephone conversation, request that your office retain custody of the personal belongings of Mr. Casolaro. This is September 1992, a year after his death, until we have completed our review and study of the autopsy report and the related documents. What related documents are they talking about? We expect to complete our review shortly and will contact you as soon as we have completed it. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Should you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact First Assistant United States Attorney Thomas Durkin, and it's signed by yours truly, Helen Greenwood, on behalf of Nicholas Boer, Special Counsel to the Attorney General. And then have a look at this. Again, Miss Diana Cook Rizavi to Detective John McMillan, re Casolaro. This is dated June 12, 1993. In response to your memoranda dated June 10th, were there no official IRS documents recovered during this investigation? Do you see that they're chasing up IRS documents? It should be noted that prior to the examination of Casolaro's home, Dr. Casolaro informed patrolman and myself that the home was still in the same general condition that Danny had left it, with the exception of stacks of papers he, Dr. Casolaro, had removed from same. And these papers have not been discovered by Dr. Casolaro. See, Anne Klink went to the house and removed all of the stacks of folders of all the documents that Danny Casolaro had. And now, look at this. This is to the Department of US Treasury, dated June 8th, 1993. This letter is to confirm your meeting with Special Investigator Jimmy R. Cupp on June 3rd, 1993. Mr. Cupp is conducting an investigation into possible disclosure of confidential tax information by an Internal Revenue Services employee in Martinsburg, West Virginia. It has been alleged that Danny Casolaro was to meet with this employee at the time of his death. It is requested that any information or documents that were discovered in the investigation by your office of Martinsburg Police Department into the death of Danny Casolaro regarding any disclosure be provided to Mr. Cupp. The alleged targets of the disclosure have been furnished to you by Mr. Cupp. Your assistance in this matter is deeply appreciated. If you have any questions or desire additional information, please contact Mr. Cupp. Regional Inspector Richard Steinberg, signed, Inspector in Charge, U.S. Treasury. I do not understand why Christian Hansen, Zachary Treats are questioning Peter Osborne and Covert Action magazine about these matters when they held all of the Martinsburg police records. See, their interview questioning me and the credibility of the Covert Action magazine article about this evidence is after they've finished releasing the Netflix series. So they knew that these documents existed when defaming me. And then this one is to Captain T.C. Anderson and Patrolman S.L. Armour. Follow up a memorandum from Diana Rizvi regarding information on Casolaro's investigation. I have checked the entire case file of Casolaro investigation and cannot find any IRS documents that we might have seized. We did request copies of his tax return from the family, but they were never provided. There was paper found in the descendant's left boot, but that was just an outline. Robert Nichols' name was on the outline, but was not an IRS document. If the inquiring agency would be to photograph the piece of paper, they will contact the Justice Department because that is where the evidence was sent. Isn't that interesting that the evidence was sent to the Department of Justice? We have a recorded interview with Trey Casolaro, the son, and he told us that they found that piece of paper in his father's boot, hidden in his shoe, and on it was the name President George Bush Sr., George Pender, Robert Booth Nichols, CIA Richard Helms, and other individuals that Danny had hidden in his shoe. The most important thing is that Trey confirms that on the list was George Bush Sr. And now the real document. Christian Hansen and Zachary, why didn't you show this to the public? Danny Casolaro had picked up boxes of documents from the IRS Computer Center in Martinsburg on Friday, the 9th of August. It should be Friday the 9th. But look at this. It's to Captain Ted Anderson. June 10th, 1993. We're 2 years after Danny's death. I have received the attached correspondence regarding inquiry from Treasury Department, Security Division for the IRS. The targets referred to are Robert Booth Nichols, Mario Renda, Harold Okamoto, and Abraham Ali. They are interested in knowing whether we recovered any official IRS documents containing these individual names. My recollection is that we did not. However, could you check to be sure? And confirmed to me a written response so I can comply with the request. Thank you for your attention on this matter. The boxes of documents were put into the boot of the trunk of Danny Casolara's car by the head of security of US Treasury Computer Center. It appears that their investigations on these matters were shut down due to the fact that CIA was preventing IRS and organised crime divisions from prosecuting the parties involved. Who took the documents from Danny's car? Who took the two sealed envelopes of documents on Pentagon fraud involving Hughes aircraft that Danny had? Who took his briefcase stuffed full of documents, the BCCI records, the copies of everything he had taken with him? The briefcase was packed full, as confirmed by Danny's cleaner, maid, before he left for Martinsburg, and also confirmed by one of the maids who witnessed when Danny Casolara opened the door on the previous day. She saw his briefcase open, stuffed with documents. And now we know the targets. They want to know where the records are. They're all missing from Danny's hotel room and car. So let's zoom in on the first two. The IRS records that were given to him relate to Robert Booth Nichols's companies and Harold Okamoto. Robert Booth Nichols and Harold Okamoto worked for Frank Colucci. That has been confirmed in multiple correspondence and testimony of Robert Booth Nichols in court by himself. More importantly, Robert Booth Nichols is identified to be linked to the Gambino Mafia and Yakuza, and Harold Okamoto is with Yakuza. And the records show that Harold Okamoto was involved with casinos in Lebanon, with Fidco and Meridian International, arms deals with Robert Booth Nichols, in Australia, identified under the Royal Commissions, and investigations of their links with the Mafia, drugs, arms coming from Iran-Contra, through Australia, missiles, guns, Wackenhut, Fidco, and their links to CIA. So let's have a look at our recorded interviews that we were prepared to give to the Martinsburg police. And this was from Thomas Gates, former FBI agent. He confirms that he received my emails with the evidence of the BCCI checks, and I was seeking his assistance to help me with Trey Casolara, Danny's son, reopen the investigation into the death of his father, given overwhelming documentaries, including motive and suspects, who were never interviewed by the Martinsburg police, the FBI, or US Department of Justice investigators. Thomas Gates stated categorically, "I believe that our friend was murdered." "I too believe that our good friend was murdered," he repeats. "I also had extensive conversations with the police department back in West Virginia at the time. We also had a separate FBI investigation into that. Was a complete debacle. My current concern is when I was told that Robert Nichols had died in Switzerland, this is later on in 2009, it was obvious to me that it was a fake death." In 1985, from the official FBI investigation reports that I have copies of and Danny Casolara had copies of. 1985, Robert Booth Nichols had a license to carry a concealed guns and submachine gun, confirms Robert Booth Nichols is the chairman of Meridian Arms Corporation in California. Confirms Robert Nichols is involved with research and development of blowback weapons, advanced destructive weapons, air fuel bomb. Confirms Robert Booth Nichols owns properties in Australia. Its address is 8 Sandford Street, St Lucia, Queensland, Australia. Also confirms that Robert Booth Nichols owns an apartment in England. Its address is 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, London, which is the apartment he rang from when passing his condolences on to Tony Casolaro and Wendy Weaver. It also is the same apartment that sold all of the damaging memo documents for the $4 billion Arab loans affair that involved Ted Shackley, Frank Lucci, and Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, Robert Booth Nichols, when selling them to destroy the Whitlam government in 1975. And also confirms that he owns properties in the United States, Italy and France. So Danny Casolaro has been provided with the IRS investigations of Robert Booth Nichols to trace all of his finances and company dealings. It would have been damaging evidence to show Robert Booth Nichols is involved in drugs and arms in America, Hawaii, Australia, as confirmed in our Royal Commissions. And here is a copy of the report that Danny Casolaro had, and it confirms from FBI their wiretaps and his links with the Gambino Mafia. And that's very important for the next bits that we'll talk about. Newspaper articles show the structures of his companies, Meridian International Logistics, Meridian Arms. I have all the evidence of his arms dealing and Nagaramba arms dealing of Iran-Contra weapons in Australia that was linked to the Mafia and CIA with Nugan Hambang. I've covered this before, but as you can see, the communications from Thomas Gates, FBI, was across to the Australians, to the Australian Federal Police in Canberra, Brisbane and Queensland, and confirms that Meridian International Logistics, with its links with Eugene Giaquinto, Gambino Mafia, is involved in 500 million share fraud. The officers have participated in a Sydney-based confidence scheme in 1982, and that the officers of Meridian International Office were involved with the Gambino crime family, the Mafia and Yakuza. I have all the evidence on that. Also from the documents of incorporation and minutes, it does show that they're manufacturing caseless ammunition and artillery ammunition with a medical cap and traditional nose on each shell. That's been done with Donald Oliver, James Hacker, Peter Zukoski, and Harold Okamoto, and Glenn Shockley, who is also on the FITCO board. Isn't this interesting that they're worried and they don't know where the boxes of documents are that IRS handed across? Because IRS investigators were shut down when investigating BCCI. They were shut down when the wiretaps revealed the links of Robert Booth Nichols with the Gambino Mafia, with Cabazon Arms, and also the arms and guns and night scopes that they're doing with the Iran-Contra rebels. And as I have indicated to you, 2 months earlier, Danny Casolaro met with Ari Ben Menashe, and he's appearing at our Western Australian Royal Commission into corruption of politicians, receiving a $6 million political donation transferred across to Alan Bond, the Curtin Foundation, thanking the Australian government for the secret CIA covert Iran-Contra arms transferred through West Australian ports, including financial links with Robert Booth Nichols and Wackenhut and the Mafia, for the manufacturing of guns and weapons in Australia. And I've brought to your attention that the cheque for $6 million is from Dr. Earl Bryan, who is Anne Klink's boss, who removed all of the documents that Danny Casolaro had on all the arms deals that Earl Bryan and Robert Booth Nichols and Wackenhut are involved with Iran-Contra and in Australia, including the TOW missiles. And there's a picture of the founding members of the Curtin Foundation. This is former Prime Minister of Australia, his name is Robert Hawke, whose best friend was the CIA station chief based in Canberra during the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, and he travels to the US quite regularly and stays at the apartment owned by the former CIA chief. He receiving the $6 million donation from Earl Bryan. Passed across to Alan Bond at the back here, our media baron, who has contracts with Carlos Cadone and involved in arms and chemical weapons and manufacturing in Iraq, but also owns Lonhro with Tiny Roland, who is identified involved with the Iran-Contra TOW missiles with Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gorbanafar. And next to him is Laurie Connell, who happens to be owning a merchant bank, who's a big investor in Armtech with Robert Booth Nichols, Peter Sikorsky and the Mafia, who are manufacturing caseless guns, ammunition guns, for Australia's military SAS, counter-terrorism groups, and Philippines, Indonesia, and Kuwait, the Kuwait government. And there's the newspaper articles relating to Laurel Connell is involved with Alan Bond. Both of them are charged with fraud and investigations of their links with the mafia and heroin distributors. And I have my recorded interviews with a former business partner of Robert Booth Nichols, an Australian, who confirms that Robert Booth Nichols and Alan Nichols both stayed at his house in Western Australia. They were involved with Armtech for the sale of this gun, which was exposed as major fraud. It linked to mafia and heroin distributors with Robert Booth Nichols. And he confirms that Robert Booth Nichols was in Australia demonstrating the new guns that he's developing with Peter Sikorsky from Cabazon Arms and Armtech, owned by Peter Sikorsky, and that he was training Osman bin Laden in the use of these weapons in Western Australia. The FBI report also confirms that Robert Booth Nichols is manufacturing the G777 machine gun, and his client is the Kuwait government. There's a picture of the gun, the Armtech caseless ammunition rifle. It turns out that Armtech had announced a $350 million gun contract with a suspicious Hong Kong company called Greenhorn. This puzzled the media why they'd be selling it to a Chinese property development who needs millions of rifles. Laurie Connell wound up owning 20% of Armtech, the company with Robert Booth Nichols, Peter Sikorsky, Wackenhut, Cabazon Arms. And now, let's get to the real story, if that's not enough. US Treasury is worried that he's got records on Mario Renda and Abram Ali. I've had confirmed that Abram Ali is linked to the Lebanese and heroin distribution and arms, linked back to the president and family of Lebanon, who have major billion-dollar contracts for reconstruction with the FIDCO board, with George Pender, Robert Mayhew, Robert Booth Nichols, Glenn Shockley, Clint Murchison Jr. But who is Mario Renda? And guess what? Only a couple of months before Danny Casolaro dies, Peter Bruton, investigative journalist, is exposing that the organised crime strike force was shut down by Attorney General Richard Thornburg. That the two investigators who had resigned were trying to prosecute Mario Renda and Martin Schwimmer, and discovered their links with Farhad Azima, a CIA operative involved with their banks and involved with Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord in setting up airlines for flying tow missiles and arms for the Iran-Contra and to Iran secretly for CIA. Isn't this interesting that even the letter from US Treasury is worried that someone at the IRS computer center had handed across all their records and investigations on Mario Renda, Robert Booth Nichols, Harold Okamoto, Abraham Ali? I would have thought that would have been a fantastic bit of evidence, Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats, that you could have shown on the Netflix series. Because let me take you further on why Danny Casolaro is interested in that and why he knew to look for it. Richard Thornburg, the sixth United States Attorney General under President Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr., preceded by Ed Meese, succeeded by William Barr. Aren't they interesting names? But what's interesting is that in 1975 to 1977, he worked for Gerald Ford, and he was in charge of the criminal division. And also, 69 to 75, he was under President Nixon and Gerald Ford. Isn't it interesting that my evidence on CIA Operation Stillpoint for all the bank accounts and trust accounts that lead to George Bush Sr., Barbara Bush, Neil Bush, Michael Milken, and Ed Rogers, the attorney, is discovered by me in 2001, and I'm presenting that evidence to United Nations. And then Gerald Ford appears offering to negotiate $100 million settlement from me over fraud involving all the trustees of Johns Hopkins. Let's have a look at why that's important, because this is a lawsuit, court case, of Inslaw Inc. against Richard Thornburg, the Attorney General. In December 1989, Elliot Richardson is filing allegations that all of the evidence relating to the theft of Inslaw's Promus software and key evidence that Danny Casolaro was investigating involving trillions of dollars of gold bullion, secret trusts to force Inslaw into bankruptcy for Earl Bryan's companies and other parties to acquire control, is being blocked by Richard Thornburg. And going back, he's the same person who shuts down the organised crime strike force that's trying to prosecute Mario Renda and Fahad Azima with their links to bank fraud and Iran-Contra arms and tow missiles with CIA. And these are the allegations that are raised, that Department of Justice officials converted, stole Inslaw's computer software product through trickery, fraud and deceit. What I'm showing you are the letters and correspondence that Danny Casolaro had. DOJ has failed and refused to investigate the additional allegations of serious malfeasance on the part of Department of Justice officials and others made by Inslaw, supported by Inslaw's detailed and credible submissions to the Department. And also there are significant conflicts of interest which plagued the Department of Justice exercise of its investigative prosecutorial functions in this matter. He also states that the Department of Justice officials were part of a conspiracy to destroy Inslaw, and that the Department of Justice refusal to do so is arbitrary, capricious and contrary to the public good. And attached to it are exhibits. And I'm just going to go over them very quickly, but it says Exhibit B is Inslaw's press release and accompanying agency bid protests alleging that the Justice Department's Land and Natural Resources Division was attempting in early 1989 to use requests for proposals as thinly disguised efforts to steal Inslaw Promus trade secrets by contracting with former Inslaw software engineers to clone Inslaw's Promus software for operation on Project Eagle. In addition, Danny Casolaro, in 12 months of investigation of the Justice Department theft of Inslaw's Promus software through trickery, fraud and deceit, spoke to the Hamiltons at least every other day. It also shows that Mr. Casolaro told the Hamiltons that he had discovered a linkage between malfeasance against Inslaw and certain other scandals of 1980s, the Iran-Contra affair, the alleged October surprise in 1980, and the BCCI fraud scandal. According to Mr. Casolaro, a small group of former covert intelligence professionals, augmented by representatives of organised crime, have profited from participation in each of these scandals. According to Mr. Casolaro, these individuals included George Pender, Richard Helms, Dr. John P. Nichols, Mr. Howard Hunt, Earl W. Bryan, Peter Wiednix, and organised crime figures from Los Angeles, California. Mr. Casolaro also told the Hamiltons that he was investigating claims from former senior Justice Department and FBI officials that the FBI implemented pirated copies of Inslaw's Promus computer software as part of the Field Office Information Management System known as FOIMS in late 1988, and that the FBI had provided perjurious testimony denying the fact in US District Court in Inslaw's case. Inslaw believes that any details of Danny Casolaro's investigation should be presented to an independent counsel because of the obvious conflict of interest on part of the Justice Department and the FBI. This is critical, and now, in addition to that, it details in this under Project Eagle the previous attempts of the Department of Justice, together with the finance company Allen and Company, relative to the effort of Earl Bryan, Dominic Leahy and Paul Wamali to raise capital for Hadron. This was based in 1982. Neither has the Department of Justice sought documents from 53rd Street Ventures or its parent organisation, Alan Patrikoff and Associates, relating to communications about Inslaw, with a business having ties to the highest level of the Reagan administration. Department of Justice has not sought documents, and this is very important. Danny Casolaro, in his notes, was investigating systems and computer technology, SCT, relating to meetings between representatives of SCT and officials of the Department of Justice in connection with SCT's attempt to take over Inslaw. The same is true, so far as we can find out, with respect to the documents bearing on the communications during the years of 1981 to 1988 between Earl Bryan, Dominic Lady and Ed Meese, Peter Wiedniks, Brewer, Jensen, Thomas, Stranton and several others in relation to trickery, the efforts of Hadron, Bryan and Lady to enlist cooperation of 33rd Street Ventures on other Inslaw shareholders in acquiring the Promus software, and identify the persons on behalf of Allen and Company, made it a multi-million-dollar equity investment in SCT at the time SCT was trying to take over Inslaw. I will do a whole podcast on this because Danny Casolaro did have this evidence. He was investigating it. And I know that because in 2004, in letters from prison, Michael Riconosciuto sent to me in Australia the evidence he provided Danny Casolaro, and I've investigated it, and it's exposed in the Nugan Bank Royal Commission in Australia and the Costigan Royal Commission into the links of Robert Booth Nichols, Wackenhut, together with CIA and with gold bullion that Danny Casolaro was investigating, with secret trusts set up for US Treasury Department to set up their own secret computer system for stabilizing currencies using the Promus software. That evidence is not known to anyone else. Danny Casolaro did have all the names of the parties involved. I'll do a whole podcast and I'll prove to you that it goes to Clark Clifford, Alexander Haig, Earl Bryan, secret trust accounts involving drugs coming out of Lebanon, gold bullion, links with the mafia and CIA and all their arms deals. Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Thomas Kleins in Australia with Michael Hand. Isn't that interesting that Danny Casolaro is after all of the IRS records involving Robert Booth Nichols, Mario Renda? Now look at this. In addition, this is an affidavit signed after Danny Casolaro's death. But the evidence was first presented in November 1991, only a few months after Danny Casolaro's death. It is an employee, two consultants who are working on law enforcement and Promus software. An illegal copy had been installed at IRS in Northern Virginia on their computer systems. And the information that I have from other sources is that CIA had secretly put the modified Promus software into IRS in order for them to keep tabs on IRS investigators because of them exposing BCCI and all the arms deals and drug deals of Iran-Contra. Richard Secord, Oliver North, together with Fidco Board, together with Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, Thomas Kleins. Isn't it interesting when I do an observation on how corrupt the justice system is? The FBI investigations that are shut down at the request of CIA. It seems that if you look at the history of when they tried to prosecute John Gotti from Gambino Mafia, they couldn't prosecute him for murder or criminal activities, but they could prosecute him for not paying his taxes. I believe that that was the same avenue that was being taken for prosecuting Dwayne Claridge, Ed Wilson, Thomas Clines, Richard Secord, Oliver North. Everyone knows that they're all involved in illegal activities, assassinations, selling of arms, drugs, money laundering of gold bullion. But if they've earned money in secret bank accounts and haven't paid taxes, that seems to be the one thing that CIA has difficulty in stopping. So that's the reason for putting the Promus software in for case management. They need it to keep a handle on what IRS is doing that they didn't have any control over, and hence the illegal copy of Promus software. And this is the outline. Confirms that Gerald Schultz works for IRS, was transferred to the IRS, and he stated in conversation that IRS was attempting to use Promus but not successfully. It goes through, talks about that Mr. Schultz was doing the modifications and installations, and it says here that Joe Pate, who's the one giving the affidavit, previously worked for LEA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, and he was totally familiar with Promus software developed by Inslaw and the legal case. And what he was concerned about is that he had a witness, a programmer, contracted, confirming that there is an illegal copy of the Promus software installed at the computer center of IRS. So I believe, and this is the conversation that we recorded with Bobby Riconosciuto, is Michael was concerned that they were using software, particularly FOIMS from FBI or any other software, to do the searches for Danny Casolaro and print out the records, because Michael did a modification for the Promus software for CIA that included an audit trail. That audit trail knows that someone's using it, and more importantly, it sends a flag to the octopus that someone is investigating things that are damaging to them. So they were tipped off that Danny had picked up the boxes of documents that they were printing out for him. I believe the octopus was all over Danny when he picked up the records from IRS relating to Robert Booth Nichols, Harold Okamoto, Mario Renda, and their links to Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, Richard Secord, Oliver North, and Dwayne Claridge, and George Bush Sr. And in this affidavit, Mr. Schultz told me the IRS was in fact attempting to use the same Promus software but was encountering some difficulties, and that his responsibilities included providing support to IRS Criminal Investigation Unit on the use of Promus. I regard this information as very significant because I was unaware that Inslaw had licensed Promus to IRS. I therefore telephoned and faxed William Hamilton, president of Inslaw, in mid-November 1991, and gave him Schultz's name and his office details in the IRS Computer Center component of Northern Virginia. Telephone numbers, date November 19. And this is given in an affidavit to Elliot Richardson and to William Hamilton. So now let's look at the overwhelming evidence of the cover-up of the records that Danny Casolaro had picked up. Quite clearly, he wasn't depressed. That should be the 9th of August. My mistake there, but I'll come back to that later. Friday, the 9th, he was found dead on the 10th, Saturday. Let's have a look at Maria Renda. And surprise, surprise, Christian Hansen, Zachary have all these records of Maria Renda, IRS records. And guess what? The evidence is in Australia. August 19, 1990. a year before Danny's found dead. FBI agents travelled to Australia to arrest Franklin Winkler and Leslie Winkler, the business partners of Mario Renda, for defrauding Indian Springs Bank, Coronado Federal Saving and Loans Institute, and the First United Fund. Franklin Winkler is the business associate of arms dealer, surprise, surprise, Adnan Khashoggi and Prince Rania of Monaco. What's the chances, Christian Hansen, that all the royal commissions in Australia into the Nugan Bank, the links of Robert Booth Nichols, Wackenhut, with mafia, CIA, arms, drugs and heroin coming out of Lebanon, gold bullion going through the banks in Australia of Nugan Bank, arms shipments and arms deals with the mafia, CIA in Australia, and you leave out that Danny Casolaro's itinerary was to go to Australia for 7 days to meet with the Royal Commission that is investigating all this. And here's the press cuttings in the Australian newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald, confirming the links and arrest of Franklin Winkler, his father Leslie Winkler, who escapes to Israel. Isn't that interesting? His father escapes and is to Israel and can't be extradited to face charges. And it's showing that they've defrauded all the banks involved with Arab finance and Kuwait construction contracts. Isn't that interesting? And there it is. It was a 3-year operation by FBI to haul Winkler back to the US to answer 27 charges in his partnership with Mario Renda. It shows the links with Indian Spring Bank, with Anthony Russo and Sam Daly, with Mario Renda, president of First United Fund. When you look at the court cases, which I have all that evidence. It involves all their dealings in Panama. Isn't that interesting? Everything seems to be going to Panama. And talks about that the mafia had a hit on Franklin Winkler over some corrupt loans deals that were being done, and he'd been shot twice. He wasn't seriously wounded, but it involved Hawaii projects, development projects, and partnerships they had for companies and dealings with Adnan Khashoggi in Panama and Kuwait. Seems like all roads lead to Kuwait. And guess what? It was a major investigation by the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, and FBI. Led to an indictment against Winkler and his father, Leslie Winkler, and Renda and Frederick Figg. They were all charged with fraud and were fleecing all of the savings and loan banks. Also were linked across with mafia and with the Teamster Union retirement funds. Apparently they milked hundreds of millions of dollars from small banks and saving loans organisations, and eventually cost the taxpayers up to $500 billion. And it all seems to be going to what's called the Indian Springs Bank. And guess what? April 5th, 1991, a few months before Danny dies, Pete Bruton, investigative journalist, publishes in Texas that he's discovered from IRS and organised crime investigators who had resigned after Richard Thornburg shut down their organised crime unit that was trying to prosecute Mario Renda over all this fraud. He began to look into Mario Renda, Martin Schwimmer, and the organised crime strike force in Brooklyn had filed these and brought these indictments, and Mainland was one of the SNLs that they were brokering union pension fund money into. And these people were tied into the mob. So that led to the next story. Mob figures dealt with Mainland. And so Peter Bruton starts to investigate and follows the links of Mario Renda with Herman Beebe, mobster from Louisiana. And he found connections in California and Texas with Renda and mob associate in New York. It turns out that Mario Renda represents the Gambino Mafia's investments. Isn't that interesting? All the Gambino Mafia links with Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, and my interviews that I did with Dee Ferdinand, the daughter of Albert V. Carone, who the RCMP were doing their investigation that they were sold the Promus software, and that they were investigating CIA's links with the Gambino Mafia, with Albert V. Carone, the bank accounts in London, America and Canada for the laundering of drugs and arms through Canadian banks using the Promus software. And so his investigations led to Beebe, Robert Corson, and CIA contract agents. And that's when they followed it through, and guess what? They state categorically, I went to see Lloyd because I thought maybe that is it. Sure enough, it was Lloyd ended up leaving the Justice Department at the time that Attorney General Richard Thornburg abolished the organised strike forces. A lot of good prosecutors left because that including Bruce Maffeo in Brooklyn, who prosecuted Renda and Schwimmer. This is in mid-1989. Lloyd finally went on the record about some of the stuff involving, wait for it, Fahad Azima, a CIA operative in Kansas City who was involved with the bank there with Renda, was involved with. And this now is, I believe, the reason that Danny Casolaro was interested in these records. It turns out one of the very first places where you discovered this CIA link was the Indian Springs State Bank in Kansas City. I think we can say Indian Springs was a mob-controlled bank. A guy named Anthony Russo, who was a disbarred lawyer, he got disbarred for interstate trafficking, prostitution and bribery, a well-known mob associate. He would bring in mob accounts, mobsters not only from Kansas City but from Chicago, maybe even St. Louis. Russo was also involved with Morris Schenker, the mob lawyer from Las Vegas. In fact, Russo was helping Schenker associate broker gas to Azima's Airlines, Global Airways. Russo was also working for Azima. Russo brought Azima to Indian Spring State Bank. He also brought Renda. Isn't this amazing that this is months before Danny dies and he's picking up all the records from IRS from their investigations on Robert Booth Nichols, Harold Okamoto, together with Mario Renda. And then he goes on, Renda was brokering deposits in exchange for loans for his associates. These were loans primarily on land and condos in Hawaii. The bank lost about 5 to 6 million. Renda deals would be enough to put it under. Azima was the fourth largest stockholder of the bank. He was one of the biggest borrowers. And this is when we come into it, somewhere between 50,000 to 500,000, depending on, look at the numbers, but global But according to an attorney who investigated this, Global Airlines and Azima definitely contributed to the failure of the bank. They had large overdrafts. These were going to support their operations, which in many cases were CIA operations. Global had some interesting connections. Some people believe Global was not only working for the CIA, or basically a CIA proprietary, but actually owned by CIA. They definitely were transporting arms equipment all over the world. Isn't this interesting? Russo got $25,000 out of it. The jury ended up hung, but in that case he let it slip that this was a CIA deal. And it's been suggested that is why the jury couldn't come to a decision. That's possible. During that case, Azima was scheduled to testify in a certain order, and he had his testimony taken out of order so that he could attend a fundraising banquet at the White House. He was a big donor to the Republican Party. As a result, Russo's still walking around loose, engaging in many of the same activities you found several years ago. That's correct. Russo was never prosecuted for anything. He was investigated. The IRS was investigating him. The IRS went to the Justice Department to ask that the FBI be brought in. The FBI came in and reported back to Justice Department that Azima had a get-out-of-jail-free card from the CIA, and that stopped the investigation. This is the reason that IRS is handing all the investigation records to Danny Casolaro. He has the BCCI checks. He has the evidence of all the parties are linked directly to the mafia. Fidco board, Robert Boot Nichols' companies, mafia, Yakuza, arms deals, Iran-Contra, Wackenhart, heroin distribution, gold bullion, Nukenham Bank. And this is the most important statement that Pieper makes. Why was Azima essentially immune from prosecution? And the investigators who resigned said, I think the FBI and the CIA have an understanding that CIA can go to the FBI and say, there is national security involved here, don't do it, back off. And the FBI will generally do that. It's the left hand and the right hand. And having the FBI investigate the CIA is like having the left hand investigating the right hand. It's nonsensical. They both work for the same person, the President of the United States. And this is George Bush Sr. And the FBI will naturally stay away from this unless you have got some particularly hard-nosed investigator. Usually it's the IRS. The IRS will go into places that the FBI won't and run afoul of the CIA. This is the reason for the octopus CIA. George Bush, Ted Shackley, Robert Booth Nichols, George Pender, Robert Mayhew, Thomas Clines, Richard Seagood, Oliver North needed a copy of their modified promo software put in at IRS. They needed to know what damaging evidence they had against them. In the case of Azima, it was an IRS investigator that started the whole thing. In fact, I believed after the FBI had been told to back off, the IRS investigator continued to push at the Justice Department, but nothing happened. It's interesting that Azima moved to London, and I don't think you can be extradited for IRS charges from London to the United States. There have been a couple of other federals who have looked into this, and they have met resistance. I think there's just a natural reluctance on the FBI's part because they know what a tar baby it's going to be. And this is now getting into some really interesting areas. He also indicated that CIA figures you mentioned was Robert Courson. what was he up to? Coulson was sort of a small-time 2-bit developer in Houston. In 1986, he brought this little savings and loan, Kingsville, Vision Bank Savings, 70 to 80 million in assets, very small. He busted it out basically with one land deal in Florida, where Vision Bank loaned 20 million on a huge 21-acre land deal in which one of the Coulson's associates, Mike Atkinson, who had almost driven the Meierland shopping centre into the ground after he bought 21,000 acres from St. Joe Paper Co. in the Florida Panhandle. Hill Financial Savings in Pennsylvania loaned 70 to 80 million. The attorney in Florida that put that all together, whose company was going to buy, was Lawrence Freeman. Now, I'm going to pause at this point. In the future, I'm going to do a big podcast. The evidence relating to this component is Mike Atkinson, Lawrence Freeman. Mike Atkinson was involved in huge land development deals with Kuwait, with the royal family. During my investigations over the last 6 years, I have come into contact and am sharing evidence together with the daughter of John Dick, who was handling all the trust accounts, Compendium Trust, set up by Mike Atkinson, the secret trust accounts that he manages for George Bush Sr. And we have discovered collaboratively and independently the trust accounts in Panama and in Jersey that are linked to the attorneys and directors of Nugan Bank. And I've been in communications with the Australian Federal Attorney General confirming that we have the details of the trust accounts involving Australian banks today, involving Citibank, Deutsche Bank, Bankers Trust, ANZ Bank Trusts in Jersey, Panama, involving the same attorneys in Panama who are listed on Nugan Bank Panama Division, are running all these trust accounts linked to George Bush Sr. What is the chances of my evidence on Promise, CIA Operation Project Hammer, CIA Operation Stillpoint using the Promise software? When I followed the money, it goes to a company called Ignite Inc., owned by Neil Bush, George Bush, Barbara Bush, Michael Milken, Ed Rogers, the attorney who worked for George Bush Sr., stepped down just before Danny dies to represent the directors of BCCI in their defence, and the ambassador of Kuwait involved in the use of the Promise software for restabilising the Kuwait dinar. I have all that evidence. You just follow the money and the octopus. And why is that important? Because on the note in Danny Casolaro's shoe found by the police was the name of George Bush Sr. And the trust accounts linked to this go to the Bush family, and more importantly, linked to Thomas Clines, Ted Shackley, Robert Booth Nichols, Frank Colucci, and Secretary of State James Baker. I will do a definitive podcast that the Promise software for a secret treasury system was put in under using the Promise software when James Baker was the Secretary of Treasury. And the Promise software using AI, developed by Rupert Murdoch's company, was developed for James Baker as Secretary of State, and he was using it for the planning of Operation Desert Storm. You can't make this stuff up. Follow the money and the corruption and the cover-up, and this is overwhelming evidence that Danny Casolaro was exposing that the octopus was involved with everything. And so in Australia, I have proven in a podcast for the $4 billion Arab loan that brought down the Whitlam government in 1975. I followed the checks, the money, the correspondence, and it went to banks owned by Paul Halliwell and the founders of Nugan Bank. The bank accounts. The whole scandal that brought down the democratically elected Whitlam government in 1975 goes to the very banks, and it involved Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci, Michael Hand, Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, Thomas Clines. And it goes to all of the same parties, Castle Bank, Paul Halliwell, and the Bahama Bank and Trust, the founders of First National Bank, with the Kuwait royal family and with Jackson Stevens. You can't make this stuff up. And then here's the important part. Only 3 months before Danny dies, Pete Bruton then identifies the next link when he's investigating Mario Renda and Farhad Azima, links with CIA. There's also another Contra connection to Silverado. I ran into a guy named Wayne Reeder when I was investigating BB. Reeder was a California developer who BB met out in California. They would loan each other money back and forth and talked about doing deals together. And I think BB actually got Reeder into the insurance business, where he is now under investigation in 3 or 4 different states. Reeder was one of the big borrowers at Silverado. Isn't that interesting? As we go back to Neil Bush. He borrowed $14 million on a project in Southern California. I think it fell through, and the loan, and I believe it's now in default. He certainly hasn't paid it back yet. Reeder was also involved with a guy named John Nichols. They had this scheme to manufacture machine guns on an Indian reservation in California to sell to the Contras. I believe they even met with Eden Pastora, the Contra leader, to discuss this. So there again, you are back into this never, never land. You can't make this up. Danny Casolaro was going to meet with Sam Cross. I have all the records in Australia. I have all the confirmation of royal commissions that Robert Booth Nichols, Peter Sikorsky were manufacturing machine guns from Cabazon Arms, Armtech in America, Armtech in Australia, linked to the mafia, heroin distribution, and linked to Alan Bond, and also with Laurie Connell in the WA Inc. Royal Commission that Ari Ben-Menashe is testifying. $6 million was transferred across to Alan Bond and the Prime Minister of Australia to thank them for all the Iran-Contra arms, the missiles, tow missiles, the planes and guns going through the ports in Australia. This is all in the evidence of Mario Renda and Farhad Azima linking to back to Wackenhut. And so he says, but even when they show fraud and try to recover the money, there are incredible obstacles. Mario Renda is a perfect example. This is an Alice in Wonderland story. You just can't believe it's true. When Renda was convicted, he agreed to pay restitution of like 9.9 million in addition to a criminal penalty of 4.2. Apparently, the FDIC made an agreement with the Justice Department that the 4.2 million would come out of the 9.9 million. Renda was just recently released from jail before he made restitution. They had him in jail. They could have said, you will stay here until you make restitution. We will probably never see a dime of restitution. Apparently, the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing, and the correctional institution released him without determining from the FDIC that he had not made restitution. How corrupt is this? And so it says in summary, Renda, he didn't have to pay a dime of restitution, not a dime of criminal penalty, and he's probably working on some new scam. This is independent evidence that US Treasury, the US Justice, FBI, are all worried that Danny Casolaro picked up all the records and documents of their investigation of Mario Renda and would be able to put it all together. And so the following year, P. Bruton did publish his book, The Mafia, CIA and George Bush, Corruption, Greed and Abuse of Power in the Nation's Highest Office. The Untold Story of America's Greatest Financial Debacle by Pete Bruton. This is incredible evidence. We also have proof that Danny Casolaro was also in communications with Mary Fricker in terms of the evidence that she was uncovering, in terms of the raiding of the thrift banks and SNLs, and the financing of Oliver North's Iran-Contra organisations. And they clearly are also exposing their evidence on Mario Renda and Farhad Azima, and confirm his links with Morris Stenker and with Eastco, an air freight company with ties to former CIA personnel Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, Ed Wilson, Richard Secord, Michael Ledeen. All the people involved with the tow missile deal with BCCI payments that Danny Casolaro has. And confirms that Iran-Contra middleman Adnan Khashoggi was an associate of Mario Renda and borrowed from Mainland and Lama savings and loans in Texas, leaving them with $48 million loss. Goes further, the Houston Post reported that Adnan Khashoggi also got $5 million from Mainland Savings, $5 million from it, and transferred $5 million into Lake Resources in Switzerland to jumpstart Colonel Oliver North's secret Iran-Contra machinery. He was also an associate and owner of Summit Savings in Dallas, who was part of Herman Beebe's network. Pardon me. I think, without a doubt, this evidence should have been on Netflix. If Danny Casolaro's car is seen by an independent witness to be parked near the IRS computer centre in Martinsburg on Friday, the 9th of August, in the morning, and we have confirmation that he called witnesses, confirming he's picked up all the documents, and then you've got correspondence going backwards and forwards from the Department of Justice, US Treasury, FBI. They're all worried that Danny Casolaro has got his hands on all of these documents related to Mario Renda and CIA, the mafia. I believe that President George Bush Sr. would be worried, Ted Shackley would be worried, Richard Secord would be worried, Oliver North would be worried, Thomas Kleins would be worried, Robert Booth Nichols would be worried. There's the motive to kill him. Mark Lombardi, in his diagram, using link analysis, was able to link global airlines with Farhad Azima, Mario Renda, directly to Oliver North, Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein, Ed Wilson, Richard Secord, and Michael Ledeen. In my podcasts, I've proven that the BCCI checks for $4 million, $1 million, and the accounts set up with Monte Carlo were all negotiated by Michael Ledeen, Ted Shackley with Gorbanafar. And the final links come from Pete Bruton. Global International's planes based in Miami were maintained by Southern Air Transport, another CIA proprietary, according to Frank Van Gesso, an employee of Global International. Pilots for Global International ferried arms into South and Central America and returned to Florida with drugs. Indian Springs also made a loan of $400,000 to Morris Schenkter, owner of June's Hotel in Las Vegas. Former attorney Jimmy Hoffa, close associate of Dick Civella, and other Kansas City organised crime figures. At the time of the loan to Schenkter was made, he, Civella, and other Kansas City mobsters were under indictment for skimming $280,000 from Las Vegas Tropicana, a casino. I think we now have the definitive proof that Danny Casolaro was hot on the trail, was being helped out by disgruntled IRS investigators who know that their prosecutions of Farhad Azima, Mario Renda were circumvented by CIA, FBI, and the Department of Justice, all in the name of national security. And you will find even in Oliver North's notes, Logistical Network, he gives confirmation of a shipment of 23 tons of tow missiles to Iran by Race Aviation, another company owned by Farhad Azima. Pete Bruton, in his investigation of Indian Springs bank collapse, was told that FBI had not followed up on Indian Springs because the CIA informed them that Farhad Azima was off limits. Posted Houston Post, February 8, 1990, before Danny Casolaro is found dead. Similarly, the Assistant U.S. Attorney handling Indian Springs investigation was told to back off from a key figure in the class because he had ties to CIA. And it's categorical. Farhad Azima did indeed have ties to CIA. His relationship with the agency goes back to the late 1970s when he supplied air and logistical support to EastCo, Egyptian American Transport Services Corporation, a company owned by CIA agents Thomas Kleins, Theodore Shackley, and Richard Secord. EastCo was prominently involved in the activities of former CIA agent Ed Wilson, who shipped arms legally to Libya. Global International also had unsavoury connections. In 1981, Global International made a payment to organised crime figure Anthony Russo, convicted felon and recorded including conspiracy, bribery and prostitution charges. I think we now have the definitive proof. So let's wrap up. Why was Danny Casolaro being provided with the IRS records? And I believe that all the investigators who resigned after Attorney General Richard Thornburg shut down their investigation organised crime unit, he's the key person who's preventing Elliot Richardson and William Hamilton from gaining access to all of the records of the investors and the parties involved with Earl Bryan, Ed Meese, and other parties who are trying to seize control of Inslaw Inc. so they can control the Promus software. I have proven that the Promus software was designed for SWIFT banking, covert transfer of funds through SWIFT transactions through banks that cannot be detected. More importantly, it's been integrated with artificial intelligence so that they can use numbers and association and actually break it down into small packets that transfer under 10,000 can be collected back, but the identities are hidden from all authorities. And so I have a podcast on my website called The Fox Looking After the Hen House, and I prove that it was Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, Frank Colucci, Richard Secord, Oliver North, Michael Ledeen, all the people in Eastco, together with Ed Wilson, that had the company that was contracted to develop the Promus Swift banking software. I proved it from the resumes and incorporation of the documents in my podcast. There's evidence, by the way, that Danny Casolaro had the checks, had the links, knew that it involved Robert Altman, Adnan Khashoggi, and we know that the Martinsburg police also have a girlfriend of Ted Shackley, meets Danny Casolaro at a party, 4th of July, goes back to his house and is caught secretly going through his evidence files. They're the bank accounts that Danny had with the note. The signed checks, Adnan Khashoggi, 1 and 4 million with Gorbanafar. The BCCI letters and accounts, all the transactions, and confirmation and testimony that Robert Sensi worked for William Casey, Robert Gray, Clint Murchison, and the Kuwait royal family when organising those checks through BCCI, First American Bank. This is also confirmation that all roads lead to Kuwait. Only days before, a few weeks before Danny dies, the auditors of BCCI discover in London that 60 million was transferred to terrorist Abu Nidal's BCCI account by the Kuwait embassy. In addition, there is the handwritten card and notes of Danny Casolaro in his folder, and it confirms Abu Nidal, Senator John Kerry's investigation, and surprise, surprise, first name, Richard Thornburg. In relation to the Tampa, Florida, 5 BCCI directors arrested, money laundering Noriega's drugs. Isn't this incredible evidence? And now the letter that Martinsburg police, the note, one page that they have, involves the transactions of the tow missiles involving Ted Shackley, manager Gorbanafar, Michael Ledeen, Adnan Khashoggi, Tiny Rowland, Ari Ben Menashe. And Alan Bond was a shareholder in Lonhro with Tiny Rowland, who receives the $6 million cheque from Earl Bryan. On the 2nd of July, 1 month before Danny's found dead, Danny is interviewing Ari Ben Menashe, Richard Secord, Robert Gates are being exposed, involved in selling arms and the Promus software to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein. And their knowledge and involvement with these arms known as Iraqgate. And then, 4 days before Danny's found dead, it turns out that Dwayne Claridge had lied under testimony, implicating Robert Gates, Oliver North, Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen and Richard Secord about their knowledge of the transfer of the Hawk missiles in 1985 through to 1986 that were paid for by BCCI 1 million, 4 million, plus the 20 million account in Monte Carlo and Lake Resources. The smoking gun evidence that Danny has is relevant to this, and it turns out that they had lied to the Iran-Contra hearing. Isn't this just incredible? And now the part that's important, the BCCI scandal, the money laundering of the drugs and arms, and the BCCI directors that were giving testimony during the investigations. It says here, a former employee of BCCI told the IRS of alleged money laundering of BCCI back in 1984. The Internal Revenue Service, whose agents repeatedly interviewed BCCI official Aziz Rekman over 4 years, is now looking into why the agency didn't do anything. Alleged inaction on the BCCI case by the IRS, the Justice Department and other federal agencies is drawing increasing fire from critics in Congress. But in 57-page deposition taken in 1988 by investigators for Senator John Kerry, he told of toting extremely heavy bags of cash around the streets of Miami. BCCI has also been accused of secretly taking full or partial control of several major US banks or SNLs. BSCI is under indictment in New York. Rekman told investigators that in 1984 he contacted the FBI, which referred him to the IRS. Rekman said he was eventually interviewed by 5 special agents for IRS between March 1985 and autumn 1988. He told investigators for Kerry that he even supplied IRS agents with 3 years of computer printouts of major BCCI Miami customer transactions showing huge sums are deposited in offshore accounts. BCCI's Tampa operation, where BCCI and some officers were convicted in 1990 of laundering drug money. IRS spokesman Frank Keith said Monday that the agency started an internal investigation to find out why the undercover probe was stymied. This is September 10th, 1991, 4 weeks after Danny's death. And August 11th, the day after Danny's found dead, there's confirmation that the BCCI officials were convicted on charges they laundered drug money for former Panamanian dictator Manuel Antonio Noriega. A federal grand jury in Miami on Friday indicted Bill Bisi on tax evasion charges. In 1988, Florida banking officials alleged Farron helped CenTrust fool regulators by arranging for BCCI to buy $25 million in slow-selling CenTrust junk bonds. In 1986, bin Mahfouz family, the Saudi Arabian banking family that owns the 1,800-acre Metro West development in southwest Orlando, purchased 20% of BCCI. This is incredible because you will find when you investigate this, it goes back to the Kuwait royal family and their land deals. And the Michael Milken junk bonds. And now I want to bring to your attention the following. Arif Ali Durrani, a businessman, Pakistani, who has twice been convicted of US courts of selling arms to Iran. In February 1984, Durrani formed a company called Memorex Corp, which traded in parts of military commercial aircraft. Of his own account, reached sales of $16 million in 1986. He was arrested in October 1986 and convicted of trading Hawk missile parts to Iran. in what Durrani maintained were actions authorised by the US government, figures Oliver North, as part of the Iran-Contra affair, with specific aim of shipment leading to US hostages in Lebanon. Durrani was sentenced to 10 years and a $2 million fine and released after 5 years in September 1992, a year after Danny dies. Durrani said his deals were financed by BCCI. Durrani continued to protest his innocence after his release, arguing he was working on transactions approved by US and Israeli governments. And Covert Action magazine in November 1991, a few months after Danny's death, go and present the evidence of Durrani's arrest and the involvement of CIA official Alan Fires. Pleaded guilty in Washington court, having lied to Congress and federal investigator regarding the Iran-Contra affair. Fires became the first insider to name names and provide information implicating officials of the highest levels of CIA in an apparent scheme of deliberate perjury designed to sustain a veil of secrecy surrounding the Iran-Contra operation. The evidence that Danny had in Martinsburg with the Martinsburg in his briefcase was the Bob Bickel correspondence file. It was a letter of Lawrence Walsh to President George Bush, raising serious concerns that he needed to meet with him, that President Bush was using national security to stop him from prosecuting criminals, high-level officials within White House, within intelligence agencies who are involved in criminal activities. And that was Richard Secor, Dwayne Claridge, Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, and Michael Ledeen in the Iran-Contra tow missiles, but more importantly, other evidence that they're also involved in illegal arms and oil deals and dual-purpose technology to Iraq. The article shows quite clearly that it was Durrani who was one of the brokers for the Hawk missile deal back in 85 and 86. The payments were made through BCCI. They were using his company. And 10,000 tows were proposed to deliver to Iran. And they were then using the stock of tows, older design ones from NATO. So they were taking stock from NATO and moving that with Israel and then going to Iran and then replenishing it. It talks about the deals going through Panama, Austria, on behalf of Israel with CIA, and with the oil deals that they're doing also with Iran. And he told me that he had met with Oliver North in London twice. The tow shipment to Iran confirms. Finally, there is today further testimony which may erode the government's case against Durrani. Ari Ben Menashe, former member of Israeli Defense Force, after much delay, has decided to speak publicly about his involvement in a secret operation which sold billions of dollars of weaponry to Iran starting in 1980. During an interview, Ben Menashe stated that he was a personal acquaintance of Animan Nia, Oliver North's Israeli counterpart, and Shimon Peres' government. Nia was reportedly killed in 1988 in a mysterious plane crash in Mexico while allegedly trading avocados. In September 1988, the two men met in London where they reviewed their respective roles, leading the dramatic events of a Iran-Contra scandal. What is critical is Danny Casolaro met with Ari Ben Menashe. He knew the evidence that we're talking about here over the tow missile deals and partnerships that he had with Richard Branecki and the billions of dollars of arms going through Australia that he's testifying in our royal commissions in Australia the week that Danny Casolaro is found dead. So without going much further with this, it confirms all the arms, Iran-Contra tow missiles, planes, weapons with Durrani, with Oliver North, and the transactions in London, and also meetings with Noriega. Court case, evidence that he was giving, covered in November 1991, a few months after Danny's death. I invite the viewers of this podcast to go to my website, The Six Eye. I have uncovered the history of the resumes, the incorporation documents of the secret team. Eastco, Fidco, Wackenhut, Dwayne Claridge setting up the CIA Counterterrorism Center, J.J. Capucci and Associates, funded by Ed Wilson in partnership with Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, and the team with Gray and Co. with Robert Gray, who represented the Kuwait royal family and the Nicaraguan resistance fighters, were responsible for setting up all the radar tracking and aerostat contracts with Alan Bond, also developing all the intelligence database systems for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs under Richard Nixon, which became DEA. They also knew the drug interdiction program being set up with radar, so they were assisting the drug lords, the couriers, to be flying arms and drugs without detection from the radar and the beacons. And they built the control systems with Hadron Inc., with Customs. And the same team then developed Iris with banking software, the safe software for William Casey, and it was put into the Swift network. I have all the evidence on that, and it's the fox looking after the hen house. All the software being used for interception of drugs and intelligence is developed by the secret team. I then go one step further and show you that the programmers who worked for Eastco and their office out of 777 Leesburg, Virginia, Michael Ledeen, Eric von Marbod, Richard Secord, Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein, Ed Wilson, with Joseph Capucci, Neil Livingston, Robert Gray, Robert Owen, Earl Bryan. Their programming team was in a company called Operational Systems Inc. It was exposed to be involved in illegal domestic spying on nuclear demonstrators by Daniel Sheehan. And the whole team of programmers is got a LEA grant, and they move across to Simcom Inc. and develop the CIA safe software with Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc., Wang Labs, and Rupert Murdoch's company called Computer Power Group with artificial intelligence. And it's designed for NSA, CIA, and DIA, NRO, and it's the fox looking after the hen house. All the intelligence software in America, Australia, Canada has been developed by the Octopus, the secret team who sells arms, dual-purpose technology, moves sanctioned oil, gold bullion, and drugs with organised crime, with the mafia. And so this long podcast is based on the evidence in the Martinsburg police that Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats had. We now have it. It should have been shown on Netflix, not as a conspiracy that Danny Casolaro was delusional, depressed, went to Martinsburg for the purposes of committing suicide. The reports show that the Martinsburg police spent more time looking at his house for a shoelace taken from a runner and razor blades that he bought from local stores or had taken from home to go to Martinsburg because he was so depressed that he wanted to commit suicide using his teeth to slash the second wrist. Given that you cut through the tendons and nerves, you can't hold the razor blade with cuts like that. If you believe that, then you believe in fairy stories. The evidence is Danny Casolaro had the smoking gun. I have independently proven all the testimony and evidence that Michael Riconosciuto gave to Danny Casolaro and to me back in 2004, and its evidence is revealed in independent royal commissions, 3 of them in Australia, for the Nugan Bank, the Costigan Royal Commission, and the Western Australian Inc. fraud cases linked to Earl Bryan, Robert Booth Nichols, and over $1 billion of illegal arms for Iran-Contra and Iraq moved through Australia in exchange for drugs being laundered through our banks and gold bullion. And when you follow the money, it all leads to Neil Bush, George Bush, Barbara Bush, Jeb Bush, Michael Milken, and the ambassador of Kuwait. The independent testimony of Bobby Riconosciuto, and I have 2 other witnesses still alive today. I'm not going to identify their name, I promised them I wouldn't, but they're willing to testify in any US court. I made that offer to George Swartwood and their attorneys of Martinsburg Police. Not once did they respond to anything that I had written. Not once have they shown any interest to reopen the investigations. But they were happy to endorse the Netflix American conspiracy, the Octopus Murders, who state to my American attorney, we've never seen any evidence that's convinced us that Danny Casolaro committed suicide or murdered. It's 50-50 or 49-51. And they believe that there was no evidence that Danny Casolaro was depressed, delusional, led astray. If only they had shown our evidence, that they had access to our recorded interviews, our transcripts, documentary legal evidence, as they promised, Trey Casolaro and me, they lied. What was their reason for lying? What was their reason for producing a false and misleading and deceptive Netflix series that they claim gives credit to Danny Casolaro when they paint him as being delusional, depressed, and went to Martinsburg to commit suicide? We will be releasing our book very shortly. It's called Lethal Justice. It's 24 years of our investigation based on thousands of recorded interviews, legal documents, that follows the facts and evidence in Canada, Australia, and America. Visit my website. I have over almost 60 podcasts of evidence. As I state categorically, I believe in legal evidence, follow the money, royal commissions, independent of American justice system. I think the American justice system is so corrupt. In the name of national security, as Sam Cross said, they believe that the ends justify the means, and they'll do anything. And I believe that is condone the murder of Danny Casolaro in the name of national security. That's an assassination on American soil. All the podcasts up to number 11, Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats have watched. They had access to all my evidence. You can't make this up. Go to the 6i.org podcast. Why don't you watch the evidence and make your own determination whether or not you trust the Martinsburg Police, the FBI, the US Department of Justice and Treasury, that they really did investigate the evidence. And then the next question is, why did they suppress the real evidence and produce fictitious, deceptive reports? My website is dedicated to the memory of Danny Casolaro. It's got podcasts based on thousands of recorded interviews, credible research, and legal evidence. He says, I'm meeting with a source and I'll bring back the head of the octopus. I think we've proven that he had boxes of documents, a briefcase full of evidence and documents, 2 sealed envelopes, and all of that's missing from his car and his hotel room. But they missed one document. The 6i, I'm a physicist. My expertise was in medical and encryption technologies. I served as the former science policy advisor to the Australian Federal Liberal Party. I was a witness to an Australian Federal Committee of Privileges that was investigating threats made against me by a company owned by Rupert Murdoch that sold the Promus software to the Australian government. In 1998, my encryption business ventures established with United Nations SEAL program, the Australian federal government, were destroyed by CIA Operation Stillpoint. And I completed 21 years, but now it's almost 25 years of interviews, research, investigations on the Promus software affair.